common to look around at our modern world of suburban drudgery and corporate barbarism and assume that life in ancient times was different. We imagine knights as noble warriors sworn to a code. We think of daring adventures on long journeys to ancient lands of exotic mystique. We think of people as selfish and dutiful, untouched by modern greed, and even the ruling kings as ambitious tyrants, moving armies like pieces on a chessboard to wryly acquire territory. All of those notions are, of course, more fictional than your average fantasy novel. People of ancient times were even stupider than everyone you know in your daily life, rarely cared about anyone around them, and took the most greedy and cowardly action in every short-sighted decision they ever made. And today we will tell the stories of one of the stupidest kerfuffles in the pre-modern era, the Fourth Crusade. This is No One Is Competent, the premium history podcast dedicated to convincing you that everyone who was ever in charge hasn't known anything about what's going on and hasn't been any good at their jobs. I am your host, Azalea, and I am joined, of course, by my illustrious co-host, Mr. Jaharis Brunstad. Jay, how are we doing? It is February.
It is February. Well, I suppose it is February when you are listening to this podcast. Still got half a day left of January as we record this.
Jay, you don't have to time dox the podcast.
I think we do. You know, there might be some time travelers listening and they want to know how far they have to go back to stop this episode from ever happening, and now they know.
Or, we could learn new things about the Fourth Crusade between our recording on
ProPublica could come out with like a new report. It's like an expose of the Doge of Venice. You never know.
Yeah, and that could come out on Thursday, February 3rd, and this would be released on Friday, February 4th, and everything in this podcast could be shown as wrong.
Yeah, possible.
What are you doing with your life right now? I am in book hell, trying to finish my third novel, writing day and night, and I hate my characters, I hate myself, and I hate everything. And I told Jay to come up with a nice, easy, light episode that we could just do and forget. And, this is what happens when you leave him unattended.
I think a rule from now on going forward is if you want an easy episode, don't give me something to do with the Byzantines.
Noted.
Yeah. I mean, I love the Eastern Roman Empire, but as a result, whenever I look into it, it's been a long time since I read about the Eastern Romans, so it's almost kind of nostalgic for me. But yeah, kind of got a case of episode bloat with the script.
Well, it combines two of your favorite things, right? Like proving people wrong about things you know way more than them, and incredibly petty infighting.
Yeah, of course. So much infighting. And of course, if you want to reach out to us with your own petty or hopefully not so petty concerns, you can find us on Twitter at not_competent. And you can also email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Additionally, you can find our individual, Twitters either by just going to the podcast Twitter account and spending some time browsing through it, or by just going and searching for Jaharis48 and Azalea Wyatt. That's your Twitter handle, right?
Yes, and people should follow me on Twitter. I improved my Twitter game in the last 2 weeks, so I am now a worthy follow again. Yeah,
I noticed your Yoko Littner tweets. Late night Yoko Littner.
What a man thinks about at 1:15 while desperately trying to shovel enough drugs into his system to not knock himself into his unconscious should be free of judgment.
Fair enough.
We can also be reached by our email at nooneiscompetent if you want to drop some podcast suggestions, talk about incompetence you see from government and corporations in your own life, or, I don't know, send us pictures of your cats. That would also be welcome. It is of complete and key importance that all of you go out and rate us on the Apple podcasting app and any app that has, listen, steal people's iPhones and use them to leave us reviews, okay? Give us the 5 stars. Listen, this show, it's got no sponsors. It's got no advertising. We're just on our knees asking you to do things. And yes, I am stabbing my desk with a knife while I make those statements.
Go to the Apple Store, load our YouTube on every single computer. Just get those views in.
If any minors are listening to this, change the homepage of all of the computers in your school to our YouTube channel. Yell at when the IRS comes to your house to put you in prison for not paying your taxes, tell them to listen to the podcast. When your wife shows up with some cops to get her stuff back after the divorce, tell the cops to listen to the podcast. Just evangelize far and wide. Go on a crusade about it.
Yeah.
That'll be effective. That's what we're talking about, right, Jay? We're talking today about the Fourth Crusade.
Yeah, well.
Sack of Constantinople. It's going to be easy. It's going to be simple.
Hopefully. As mentioned, the story we're talking about today is that of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204 that resulted from it. Now, this story is one that most people in the West learn about from a purely, Western perspective. In fact, when we began making the script for this episode of the podcast, we began our work with a very Crusader-centric framing. The basic story of the Fourth Crusade, as it's commonly understood, is one that lends itself to being portrayed as something of a comedy of errors. The Pope calls for a crusade. The Crusaders gather, but they realize they're short on cash to pay the Venetian navy. Some shenanigans ensue, and they all end up attacking the Christian city of Constantinople instead of, the Muslims. Now, while this narrative is simple and popular and not totally inaccurate, it does reduce an arguably bigger one, that of the decline and near total collapse of one of Eurasia's oldest empires, to a mere side story. The Crusader conquest of Constantinople, a feat that over a dozen foreign armies had tried and failed beforehand, is seen as a farce, and the conditions that led to it being possible are largely ignored. In our view, the fall of Constantinople in 1204 is as much a Byzantine story as it is a Crusader one. As such, this episode will be a bit more complicated than some of our previous ones. And we'll start off by discussing the background of this event on both the Byzantine and then Crusader sides. This might be a bit complicated, but I do think it's a story worth telling.
And it's completely possible that people could be tuning into this podcast without even knowing what the Byzantine Empire was. I was actually taught about the Byzantine Empire in high school, but I took the AP history classes, so maybe that's why I got that. Usually, when you're taught European history, you learn all about the Roman Empire and how it peaked in the early centuries of AD, and then, decline, sacked and whatnot in 476, and that leads to the feudal era and the boring part of European history. But what's completely downplayed in this narrative, often only briefly mentioned, is that by the time that Rome was sacked, all of the important stuff that the Romans thought of as Roman, much of their culture, their army, their bureaucracy, their imperial prestige, had already moved to the eastern parts of the empire and continued to exist for centuries after 476. And this is what we call the Byzantine Empire today. The story goes that in 324, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great set about transforming the pre-existing settlement of Byzantium, located on the European side of the Bosporus, into a new capital city for his empire. You know, the reason they're moving there from Rome is because the East was really where all the action was. Had all, you know, the Persians and the big kingdoms they were fighting, and it was way richer and it just way more efficient to be out of there. So he goes to Byzantium. He's like, this is now named Constantinople now because my name is Constantine and I do branding like a boss-ass bitch. You then have Constantine and his immediate successors ruling over a united empire. But then, one of those empires, Theodosius I, saw the division of the empire into two halves. The Western Roman Empire centered in Italy and the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople. This happens in 395. And then, as we already said, Rome falls in 476, but that part over in the east, that did not fall. It's still going, and it's still drawing all of its history and linking to all of the Roman conquests of Gaul and of Britain and of the Phoenicians and all of that history and culture and Julius Caesar and crossing the Rubicon and shit.
Yeah, and that's really important to remember. You know, we'll be calling them the Byzantines a lot in this episode just because it keeps things a bit easier, and that's a term most people are familiar with. But they did not call themselves the Byzantines. They called themselves Romans. They weren't the successors of Rome, they were Rome. You know, Constantinople was a city where the history of ancient antiquity lived on throughout the Middle Ages. If you were to go back in time to medieval Constantinople, you would see statues dating back to ancient Greece and Rome, and you would see the Senate with senators in it. You would see, you know, the Caesar, the emperor. You would see chariot races. This was, for all intents and purposes, Rome. They just didn't have the city itself.
Two mini points. One, for anyone who's confused, the city of Constantinople is currently called Istanbul. It's the capital of Turkey. It's still a very, very important place in the world. Secondly, you know, I hate to be the bringer of bad news and bum timeouts, but like, a lot of the reason we think of like the Romans as being the Romans and the Byzantines as not being the Romans and whatnot and being different, I think it really has to do with like I don't exactly want to call it racist because it's more complicated than that, but it's just a Western European bias, right?
Yeah.
Like, modern Europeans and whites don't want to like draw their heritage from the lands of Turkey and Greece and Egypt and whatnot, even though like what was historically happening in truth. And I mean, one of the lessons of this podcast is that truth has mattered to about 7 people in the history of human civilization, Jay being one of them. And everyone else, myself included, doesn't give a flying fuck what's true and what's not.
Yeah. Now, Constantinople throughout the early Middle Ages flourished as a city. Its location at the crossroads between Europe and Asia and on the strait connecting the Mediterranean and Black Seas allowed it to prosper as a center of trade and culture. Even before the fall of the Western Empire, Constantinople had surpassed Rome in population, and it would continue to be the largest and wealthiest city in Europe for over 800 years. Now, the central location of the Eastern Roman Empire in general, though, meant that the Byzantines had to worry about quite a lot of rivals. You know, they had enemies both in Europe and Asia. Throughout Byzantine history, the empire would fight various wars against the Persians, Arabs, Turks, Georgians, Armenians, Russians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Serbs, Normans, Italians, and more.
Oh my!
Yeah. Constantinople's wealth made it a tempting target, but thankfully for the Byzantines, its naturally defensive position, enhanced by perhaps the most impressive series of fortifications found in medieval Europe, made it a tough target for would-be conquerors.
I don't pity many would-be conquerors, but like, Constantinople, it's alright, so 3 sides of it are water, so you gotta have a navy. And if you want to go by land, you have to get through 3 walls. And that ain't easy.
Yeah.
They are huge. They are very big. There's towers in between them where you can be pelted by arrows and javelins and boiling oil and all sorts of medieval fuck shits. And you just ain't gonna have a good time.
Oh, yeah. And between 376 and 941, the city was laid siege to 14 times by foreign armies. One of these was even a joint attack by an alliance between the Persians and the Slavs. And every single one of these sieges failed.
Because they did not have a good time. The Byzantines were incredibly powerful in the region. But by the 13th century, their best days were behind them. See, at the peak, the empire had controlled the entire Mediterranean basin, but now its borders have been pushed back severely. The empire still controlled Greece, the southern Balkans, Constantinople itself, and a portion of what is now Turkey. But even in these reduced territories, the empire was under constant pressure from enemies such as the Seljuk Turks and the Bulgarians.
Like the Roman Empire that was a continuation of, the Eastern Roman Empire was ruled by, an emperor. The position of emperor was not inherently based on bloodline, unlike in feudal Europe. And the emperor presided over a complex, semi-meritocratic administrative and military system. Now, to say that the Eastern Roman Empire was prone to political violence would be an understatement. The history of Byzantine politics can be characterized by a state of perpetual court intrigue. Coups, assassinations, and civil wars were frequent as claimants fought over the position of emperor, and to take the throne by poisoning or stabbing one's predecessor was almost as legitimate as to inherit it by right of birth. Like many other traditions of the Byzantine Empire, this propensity for plotting is something inherited from classical Rome.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a reason why Julius Caesar getting stabbed to death by the Senate still a pretty popular, sight in theaters around the world.
No, but I mean, like, so many Roman emperors were like, I mean, it's kind of like you stab the emperor in the middle of the night, and then you bribe his bodyguards to say you're the new emperor, and then those bodyguards kill anybody who tries to stop you, but then someone bribes them more, and it's just like, yeah, it's been a mess since, like, well, arguably since the Gracchi brothers, but I'm not Mike Duncan.
Yeah. Now, when the empire was at its height, its bureaucracy and military was strong enough to sustain a few secession struggles and coups without falling apart. As the empire declined, however, the negative impact of this interscene violence on the security of the empire would only grow. It was not an uncommon event for a Byzantine army to be called back from a campaign while on the cusp of victory in order to partake in a civil war, too. New emperors would often sell imperial land and offices to raise funds, replace experienced bureaucrats with political allies, and purge generals from the military, only to be replaced and for the whole process to repeat itself once more. Some ousted emperors would even flee to the rivals of the empire, such as the Turks and Bulgarians, seeking aid in exchange for promises of favors once they were restored to power.
To illustrate our point, let's go over a story that takes place just before the Fourth Crusade. So, the 11-year-old Alexios... Okay, is it Alexios II Komnenos? Is this how I'm supposed to read these names?
Yes. That is the format.
I hate my life. The 11-year-old Alexios II Komnenos took the throne in 1180 following the death of his father, Manuel I Komnenos, with his Catholic mother Maria as a regent. But then Alexios II and his mama are deposed and killed in 1183 by their relative Andronikos I Komnenos. Andronikos is then killed in a popular uprising and replaced by Isaac II Angelos in 1185, and then Isaac II would manage to rule for a decade before being overthrown, blinded, and imprisoned by his brother Alexios III in 1195.
Yeah, and that's just a snapshot of Byzantine politics. I had to take a few courses on the Byzantines in university, and I love them, but there's so many names to remember because it's almost like there's a new emperor every decade almost during parts of the empire.
And 75% of them end with os.
Yeah. Yep, lots of names like that.
So coincidentally, I've heard that the Byzantines were like the OG sports rioters.
Oh yeah, famously there was a big riot between the two big charioteer fan bases, the Greens and the Blues, during the reign of Justinian the Great. That more or less escalated into a citywide riot.
So imagine if like a drunken brawl at a Georgia-Bama football game started a civil war.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, out of all the things to start a civil war over,
not the worst.
That ain't bad. Far from the worst.
So in summary, at the start of the new century in 1200 AD, Alexios III is the Eastern Roman Emperor. Now, this is a name we will be returning to, so it's a name worth remembering. And he's sitting somewhat comfortable in his palace in Constantinople. Now, Alexios III had displayed the typical cunning of a Byzantine emperor by seizing the throne while his brother and predecessor, this being Isaac II, was off on a military campaign in 1195. However, displaying a somewhat untypical degree of mercy, Alexios III merely blinded his brother and imprisoned him and his whole family instead of, executing them. Alexios III's mercy would come back to bite him, as Isaac II's son, who was also named Alexios.
Because history hates you.
Yes. We'll be calling him young Alexios, because, just to keep things differentiated.
No, we're going to call him by his SoundCloud rapper name, Young Os. Young Alex. Post in the comments or email us as to what Alexios the Fourth's, what young Alexios's rap name would be.
Yeah. But this guy, the young Alexios, was smuggled out of captivity in 1201 and spirited to the Holy Roman Empire, where his sister Irene was married to Philip of Swabia, the king of Germany. Here in exile in a foreign court, Alexios would embark on another proud Byzantine tradition, plotting his return to Constantinople and his seizure of the imperial throne.
Which sets the stage for the Fourth Crusade, because this podcast is going to be sort of the intersection of two stories that have been intersecting for a while, a sort of double helix, two civilizations spiraling around one another in Europe. We've already covered the Byzantines, but it's now time to flash over to the Crusader side of things, and we gotta rewind the clock to roughly the 11th century AD. Now see, the Crusades are a weird part of history. You were taught about them in school because they involved Europeans, and you were taught a very Eurocentric version of history, but the Crusades don't exactly fit into the story of modern Europe that you're taught in school. That, like, there was the Renaissance, and then there was the Enlightenment, and that led to industrialization in the modern world, and European history is just a constant progression of things getting better and technology advancing. And the Crusades, they don't fall to that story. But at the same time, they are incredibly significant, right? Like, they involve the most powerful European states at the time, spending massive amounts of resources to move large armies around to do big battles. They made and unmade states and facilitated a lot of cultural exchange. And then, like, they became just this weird bottle episode of history that just kind of stopped, a cul-de-sac. Doesn't seem to spring from or lead to much of anything. It's weird, right?
Yeah, pretty unusual.
But these are Western Europeans, and the thing that chiefly makes them different from the Eastern Europeans we've been talking about so far is that all these fucks are Roman Catholic. At this point, the Roman Catholic Church, based out of Rome, is based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. By the way, the Cincinnati Bengals going to the Super Bowl this year. Reminded me that the city of Cincinnati exists, which I think I'd forgotten since 2017 when I was watching a couple vlog out of there. Jay, if we dropped a nuclear warhead on the city of Cincinnati, would human civilization be impacted in the slightest?
I don't know. I kind of like Cincinnati.
You've been to Cincinnati?
My aunt used to live in Cincinnati, so I've been there a few times as a kid.
I've been to Ohio like 4 times, and I just remember it as being like this flat, gray purgatory. Wait, is Cincinnati in Ohio?
As you just said, Cincinnati was in Ohio.
Listen, I am not responsible for 12 seconds ago, Azalea. That guy's crazy. Anyway, we're talking about the Roman Catholics. So the Roman Catholic Church is headed by this guy called the Pope. You may have heard of him. And he claims the title of Roman Emperor and dominion over all the kings in Europe. You know, he's God's mouthpiece on earth, wears a cool hat, does stuff. It's you know, his thing. And he claims dominion over all the Christians. But in a practical sense, he's only claiming dominion over the Christians in Eastern Europe because of what Jay's about to tell you about.
Yes, and that, of course, is the Great Schism. Not to be confused with the other Great Schism, which is between the Rome and the Avignon papacy, but that's a whole other topic. This being the original Great Schism. Now,
the OG.
European Christianity at the time, this being around the 12th, 13th centuries, was primarily divided into 2 camps, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, as a result of this schism. Now, resentment between the Eastern and Western churches had been simmering for centuries along both theological and structural lines. In terms of the structural argument, because the theological one is its own whole, topic that we could spend hours talking about, the Western or Catholic Church upheld the notion of papal supremacy and infallibility, that the Pope in Rome had jurisdiction over the entire pentarchy. Now, the pentarchy, for those who don't know, was a system set up during the reign of Justinian with 5 Episcopalian sees for, the Christian church. Those sees each had...
And see is a is like a Catholic and Orthodox, like, jurisdiction.
Yes.
You may have heard the term Holy See. I think it's spelled S-E-E. It's very confusing when intersecting with modern English, but that's what that means.
Yeah, and each one was led by an archbishop, and these 5 were Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who had grown to hold sway over most of the eastern sees, obviously did not really agree with such a system, and the divide between the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople was formalized in 1054. That's basically when the Patriarch of Constantinople was like, no, I'm not going to listen to you. The Eastern Roman Empire, as a result, was primarily what we would call Orthodox, while Central and Western Europe were predominantly Catholic.
And this would have profound repercussions, especially on Russian history going forward, but, like, all you need to know is the people ruling the Christians in Constantinople and the people ruling the Christians out of Rome, they don't get along. And also, anyone who tries to tell you this is like the first denominational split and difference between Christians is just like hilariously wrong. Like, Christians been arguing about shit since Jesus came back all the fucking time. There was a time when the religion was small enough that a bunch of dudes could just like write some letters explaining and clarifying shit and just like add those letters to the Bible, but eventually we stopped doing that, or maybe we didn't stop doing that, depending on who you listen to. But I don't talk to Mormons as a principle of basic hygiene. Anyway.
You're gonna get a bunch of negative reviews from our dozens of Mormon listeners.
I will say, Mormons are some of the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life. They are also some of the most terrifyingly backstabbing people. It's like Mormons. There's two camps: they're either the nicest or they're the meanest sons of bitches you will meet. Like there are no like just lukewarm Mormons.
Kind of like the Byzantine.
I'll never forget being briefly when I was mentally ill enough to be a college student. Getting handed out literature with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Mormon Jesus. And, like, I wasn't particularly woke back then, but even I knew enough to be like, I don't want your master race, Jesus. The thing I was going to say is I was checking our page on Apple Podcasts, and Jay, did you know that this podcast has been rated clean by the Apple Corporation?
I did not know that, and that's actually kind of surprising because on Anchor, for every episode, you select whether it's clean or explicit, and I always select explicit because, you know, we do swear here from time to time, but I guess Apple thinks otherwise.
Well, sometimes I swear, and sometimes I write swears in the script that you read.
Yeah. And that's how you know I'm reading something you wrote. That or if I say folk, because, like, I think you know this. I never say like folk or folks. Like that's just not a part of my vocabulary.
Sounds so weird. Jay, that's not how the word is it just sounds so weird in your accent. I don't understand why no one from Chicago uses the word folks. It's literally just the word people, but with one less syllable. It's just the most efficient way to talk about groups of individuals. Also, last thing I wanted to mention is before we go on a huge spiel about the Crusades, I kind of want to give modern Christians one of the many things we argue about, and we argue all the time for people who aren't Christians. We argue every day. We just scream at each other. It is incredibly terrifying. One of the things that's argued about the most is how pacifistic Christians should be. I am actually by nature a very violent and angry person, but I tend to take the stance that Christians really should not cause bodily harm or damage to anyone except for in completely unworkable scenarios where it is the only option to preserve more human life. This is highly controversial. A lot of people, especially a lot of Christian soldiers, have had very different opinions on this and things to say about the whole thing. But today, the vast majority of Christians, if you ask them, will tell you that, like, going to war and killing people is, like, not something the religion is about. Even if that's not what they believe, like, in their heart. Because most Christians, like most people, are pretty callous, bloodthirsty individuals. But they know that politely and technically they're supposed to say, it's, religion of peace and whatnot. Because, if you read anything that Jesus says, that's pretty manifestly true. So it's easy for modern Christians to wonder how the heck the Crusades could exist as people going to fight a war for Christianity, because again, if you read especially the New Testament, that seems to be completely at odds with the teachings. Well, one, the vast majority of the people who did the Crusades who had never read the Bible, because the vast majority of people who did the Crusades couldn't read anything. You just relied on what your priest told you was in the Bible, because he was the only guy in your town who could read. That's never story. More importantly is the idea that, so we now think that the reason that Europe became Christian is because the Romans converted to Christianity under Constantine. And this is true. That is a thing that just happened. But like we've been telling you, Rome moved all their shit to the east of Europe. So why the fuck did Western Europe get Christianized? And that's because of the conversion of the Franks in the late 500s-ish. Okay, and the Franks conquered all of, pop quiz, what did they conquer most of modern? Yes, France. Franks and other Germanic peoples, they converted to Christianity. But due to, their natures being really good at conquering shit, they are very warlike, and they blamed originally their god, their war god, for making them good at battle. But once they converted to Christianity, they said, no, God is making us very good at battle, and God is responsible for many of our victories. Now, the Franks, to massively just simplify this stuff, basically, the Franks are the source of a lot of what we now call the feudal system. The way it will work is, I'm a Frankish chief, me and my boys, we get together, we kill a bunch of people, we conquer some land, and then I say, all right, as a reward for helping me, you get that plot of land, down the creek, and on that other side of the creek, you get that plot of land, and that's how I keep the people who helped me loyal, all right? And then, you accelerate like 100 years, and the chief's descendants are the kings, and everyone who helped the chief, their descendants, are like the nobility. And this system leads to this sort of like tiered hierarchy of people distributing land to what are called vassals. And vassals are like, yes, me and my generations from me, my descendants, we will serve you. And whenever you want to go to war, we will go to war with you. In exchange, you will give us the land and the people on the land to rule over. And then, those folks will dole out land to their vassals and sort of chop things up from there. And what's key to this system is this all revolves around vassals swearing oaths of fealty to their lords. And traditionally, the way the Franks did oaths of fealty is what would happen is the lord would be standing up, and the vassal, who's swearing their fealty, they would traditionally kneel. They'd clasp their hands together. They'd hold their hands clasped out, and then the lord would lay their hands on the clasped hands. Now, if you think about a person kneeling and clasping their hands together, Jay, what does that remind you of?
Praying, I suppose.
Yes, the way modern Christians pray. And that came from the way the Franks prayed, because the way they thought of it was that they are swearing an oath of fealty to their Lord, which is God. You may hear modern Christians call God the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Those terms are in the Bible, but the reason they're used so much is because that is how Europeans for centuries thought of God. God was the ultimate Lord that when called, you would go to war for because you had sworn an oath the same way you would swear an oath on earth. And that is why it is chill to go to war for God, especially when the guy who claims to be the mouthpiece of God tells you to. Thank you for coming to Azalea's Bible Corner. And now we will all eat Cheetos and watch VeggieTales.
And go on the First Crusade. Hopefully, at least. Well, actually, probably not hopefully. It doesn't seem like it was very fun, but I suppose to go over it, because there are people here who might not be too familiar with the first three Crusades, let alone the fourth. The First Crusade began with the call of Pope Urban II for a crusade, and this will go out in 1095. The Pope previously had actually received a letter from the then Byzantine Emperor asking for aid. The empire was under attack from mostly the Seljuk Turks and wanted some support. And Urban decided to spin this off into this whole crusading mission based on liberating the Holy Lands from the Muslims. Now, as mentioned, the call went out in 1095, and pretty soon afterwards, a bunch of peasants, led by a guy named Peter the Hermit, decided to march across Europe, mostly down the Rhineland to Italy, and kill pretty much every Jew they could get their hands on. So that's how the Crusades kind of got their kickoff. Not the best thing. Now,
not operating on the most what's to the next bullet point.
Now, eventually, the nobility of Europe, mostly France, raised a bunch of armies and decided to trudge over to Byzantium. The First Crusade would be led mostly by nobles, people like Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon. Actual kings mostly sat it out. So these guys march to Byzantium, go into Anatolia, and they march down the Mediterranean, and were, to summarize things very quickly, very successful considering their lack of organization. They managed to take Jerusalem, and they divided the territory they captured along the coast into a bunch of new crusader states that were ruled by various dudes. One notable one was, of course, the King of Jerusalem. That would be Baldwin I. And you also had then, a bunch of minor crusader states, Antioch and Edessa. And this would lead to a bunch of smaller crusades for 100 years or so as the crusader states clash with the Muslims, the Byzantines, and each other.
Yeah, and in this whole clash and friff-raff, there would be this little side story where the Crusaders would discover the Holy Grail, which would, of course, lead to three mage families fighting over the Grail in a series of wars that would get surprisingly sexy at times, but we don't have time to cover that in this podcast.
That can be a bonus episode.
Bonus episode!
Still with us.
If this podcast ever becomes financially successful enough to warrant bonus episodes, we will do the history of the Fate franchise. That I am swearing that now. Which
sounds good.
Half of which will be just me and Jay arguing over what Fate entries are good, and it will get incredibly heated and probably in the podcast.
Yeah, it'll be the final episode. Just Fate's Day night.
Yeah. So yeah, they basically they go down to the Holy Land, they fuck shit up, they make a bunch of crusader states, and they leave. The Second Crusade, the Turks strike back. You have a Muslim ruler named Zingi, probably not how you pronounce that, but I don't care. He starts fucking up a bunch of the crusader states, and this is helped out by the fact that a bunch of the rulers of those states were kind of dying around the same time, kind of leaving everything in crisis. The Muslims go in, they kick their shit in, they capture the city of Edessa, they sack it brutally. Zingi himself would die shortly afterwards, but his descendants were just as powerful. And Pope Eugene III sees the Holy Land under threat, and he orders a second crusade in December of 1145. Things wouldn't really get rolling until 1147 under French King Louis VII and German King Conrad III, who would head across Europe but get fucked up pretty bad in Turkey. The Crusaders would not get the Byzantines' help, and they would arrive in the Crusader state of Antioch a bit wary. And this is where the Second Crusade would see some classic, what we now refer to as mission creep, as the leaders of the Crusader states that the armies arrived at, they wanted to do things other than retake Edessa. They wanted the Crusaders to retake Damascus, which had been taken by one of Dingy's descendants, who has a name that I'm not going to try to pronounce. This went incredibly poorly. The Crusaders, they start betraying each other. They found other missions to go on. To save face, Pope Eugene is like, all right, listen. If you go retake the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors, we're just going to count that as a win. And they do. That's the Second Crusade. They go, it goes very badly, and then the Pope offers them a side mission for a participation trophy. In the following years, the armies of the son of Zingi would get more and more powerful. They would batter the Crusader states more and more. and eventually a nephew named Saladin would take over as leader of the Seljuks, who is, notable as that guy from the Assassin's Creed game that no one plays because its combat is one of the most ass cancer things that humanity ever invented, and also for being really cool and a very powerful ancient leader. Saladin would fuck everybody up and capture Jerusalem in 1187, leading to the Third Crusade, which is the one you've heard of because of the branding.
Okay, just take a moment to pour one out for poor Nur ad-Din, who has not only historically looked over in favor of Saladin, everybody loves Saladin and everybody forgets about Nur ad-Din, and now in our own episode gets reduced to a guy whose name we can't pronounce. But yeah, so on to Crusade number 3. So at this point, Saladin, who again everybody loves, had conquered land stretching from Egypt to Syria, and the Muslims' armies he commanded looked very formidable. As a result of this, Pope Gregory VIII would order a crusade in 1187. Now, incidentally, this is the second pope to basically issue a crusade as soon as he gets in power. Spoiler, this won't be the last. And is this logical? Well, I guess it is, You want to do something as you get in office, kind of make your name for yourself, call a crusade or two, and everybody will remember who you are. And, who knows how many years you'll get. This is the 1100s. People don't live long. The cross was taken up by King Richard the Lionheart of England, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Philip II of France. So already we have pretty much a star-studded crusade, especially in comparison with the first two.
Yeah, at this point, the Crusades had become such like a thing that when one was called, you wanted to get in on that.
Yeah. Now, Frederick Barbarossa would do pretty well in Turkey. He actually briefly even considered laying siege to Constantinople himself, but he ended up dying while taking a bath in a level of anticlimax that would make Anicio Eason proud. You can also see that this is also not a line that I wrote, though I do like it. The English and French would thus absorb the Germans and do pretty well, beginning to push the armies of the Seljuks back. Victories would go back and forth, but the Crusaders would come out on top until they began to lose focus. The French and English factions disagreed on how to proceed as they got closer to Jerusalem, and eventually neither Richard nor Saladin had enough advantage to beat the other, so they called a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, which resulted from this, would allow Christians to pilgrim to Jerusalem, but still leave the territory in Muslim rule. Now, this crusade has pretty much the great branding and all the big battles, which is why you've probably heard the most about it.
There's a dude in it named Richard the Lionheart. Brother just called himself Richard the Lionheart, and people let him get away with that.
Yeah.
I named myself Azalea, but I didn't name myself Big Dick Azalea. Maybe I should aspire to more. Maybe I'm just, not shooting high enough.
People both in the Middle Ages and even today love the idea of, the honorable war led by these wise kings who are fair and nice to each other and will, send each other nice letters and then fight battles where tens of thousands of commoners die. And Richard and Saladin were pretty much fit right into that mold. Saladin, despite being a Muslim, gets a pretty good reputation in the West. Not without reason. But yeah, everybody likes the Third Crusade.
So fast forward a few years later, and Pope Innocent III is elected to the papacy in 1198. So we've intersected with the parts of Byzantine history that we've talked about. Jay, who's on the throne right now?
Alexios III.
Alexios III. So Pope Innocent III and Alexios III on different sides of the Mediterranean. 1198. He immediately began setting out several plans to increase the power of the papacy and push back against the authority of kings and emperors. The story of Europe for a solid 600 years is just popes and kings kind of in a tug of war of power. But, and this is an episode in that history. Pope Innocent III was highly politically active. He had expanded the territory of the Papal States, excommunicated various lords and kings, and he got involved in the ongoing civil war in Germany for the position of the Holy Roman Emperor. You know, the guy's just he's a real he's a real prep kid, lanyard wearing go getter. I hate him already. Definitely a morning person. I'm getting hard morning person vibes from Innocent the Third.
He also killed a lot of Jews, so that's I guess another reason to hate him.
I mean, I assume that was that's just like Catholic pastime. If y'all aren't aware, the Catholics blamed the Jewish people ethnically for the death of Christ until like 1960.
Yeah.
Incidentally, by the way, again, lots of Catholics are great people. I know plenty of them. But if you ever meet a Catholic who says they have like theological differences with Vatican II, that is one of the red flags. Like the red flags. And god damn it, we did a history about medieval Europe, and Azalea is going on a rant about modern fascism.
Of course.
I swore, I told myself I was going to take at least a 4-episode break from talking about fascists. God damn it!
No one is competent to do an episode without mentioning fascism challenge.
All right, people, cross out your bingo card. So, in August 1198, less than a year into his tenure, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. And while the Third Crusade had attracted kings and emperors, this new crusade would be less fortunate. People are tired. They did a crusade just a decade ago. The coffers are spent. People still have sunburns from hanging out in Turkey. I don't want to do none of that. And also, England and France are beginning one of their many, many wars with each other. The Holy Roman Empire is in a state of civil war. So Innocent's call largely falls on deaf ears of the very non-innocent Europeans. Boom, crash. But things slowly begin to pull themselves together into the Fourth Crusade. While no king would partake in the endeavor, lesser nobles, knights, pilgrims from France and Italy, they eventually begin to get off their asses, join together, raise some armies, and formulate a plan of attack.
Now, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade, as it would become, recognized that the center of Muslim power in the Near East was Egypt, not Jerusalem. Saladin had conquered Egypt in 1174, founding the Ayyubid Sultanate, and that Sultanate now controlled Jerusalem as well as much of, the Near East. As a result of this, the Crusaders came up with a plan that was different from that of the earlier Crusades. They had learned that marching over land through, in many cases, mountainous terrain and desert really was not fun. You get hungry, you get thirsty, you die, you get raided by Turkish cavalry. Not a fun time. So instead, they would gather an army of roughly 33,000 men and mount a naval invasion of Egypt, conquer it, and then turn northeast towards Jerusalem. Being mostly French noblemen, however, the Crusaders lacked their own navy. Your average French count doesn't have a fleet at his disposal. They thus entered into negotiations with the powerful Republic of Venice, coming to agreement in February 1201. In this agreement, the Venetians agreed to supply the crusade with a fleet and provisions in exchange for 85,000 silver marks and half of all the plunder gained from the crusade.
How I have no idea what 85,000 marks.
It's a lot. A mark was roughly half a pound. So 85,000 silver marks is a fair amount of silver. It's a lot of money.
So we're talking like several ships full of silver bricks.
Oh yeah, and the Venetians halted most of their trade for an entire year to get this navy ready. This was a big deal. By May of 1202, the Crusader army gathered in Venice ready for their mission. Immediately, however, there were problems evident with this new crusade. The previous leader of the crusade, a French nobleman named Theobald of Champagne, had died in 1201 and was replaced by the Italian Boniface I, the Marquis of Montferrat. Some of the French lords, however, disliked the Italian Boniface and thus quit the crusade. I guess, they decided to call it a day because they didn't want to follow an Italian.
Maybe it was because he really was an ugly dude with a mouth face.
Maybe. Now, the ongoing war between France and England in general had made recruitment difficult, as many knights were involved in that conflict, and as a result, the Crusader army consisted of only around 12,000 men, considerably less than half of the 33,000 men army that the Venetians had expected. They'd also only managed to gather 35,000 of the 85,000 mark payment.
Now, the Venetians were led by the blind 95-year-old Doge Enrico Donaldo. Yes, they called their leader the Doge because the Venetians were dank as fuck. They were furious at the Crusaders. They're like, we built all these ships for people who y'all too lazy to even show up, and you don't even got half your down payment? What even is this? But the Crusaders are like, hey, we're here, we got some money, let's do this, let's go. And so, this leads to some classic renegotiation. The Venetians, they're rubbing their temples, they're like, all right. Okay. What do we do? What do we think? Okay, well, listen. If they do a crusade, they're gonna get a lot of plunder, like way more than 85,000 silver marks. And they could also sort of clear out some of our trade rivals and give us more control of the lucrative trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is where the action always really was. And the Venetians came back to the bargaining table and they were like, all right. I think we can put something together to make this work. And Donaldo publicly joins the crusade, putting together an army of over 10,000 Venetians to join the cause. Now, in private, Boniface and the other leaders of the crusade entered an agreement with the Doge Donaldo. Basically, in order to pay off their debts to Venice, they would attack and plunder the city of Zara on the Croatian coast. It's across from Italy. Zara had once been under Venetian control, but it had rebelled like 20 years ago, and the city is now under the protection of the King of Hungary and Croatia. So, Donaldo is publicly saying, hey, we just want to join the cause, and they don't have the money, but this is all to serve the good God, and we're going to go out and do the thing. But secretly, he's like, all right, y'all beat the hell out of the people who seceded from us, and we'll all call it even Steven. Also worth knowing that they are planning to attack a Christian city ruled over by a Christian kingdom on this crusade that is supposed to be against Muslims.
Yeah. Now, this fundamental deviation from the original goal of the crusade was not lost on many of the crusaders. Around 2,000 of them quit the campaign then and there. The remaining 10,000, however, would go on with the Venetians to attack Zara. Now, as a note, a lot of times in the script we'll say Crusaders and Venetians. The Venetians are on a crusade. They are Crusaders too at this point, but it's just useful to kind of differentiate, the French knights from the Venetians, because they will have, kind of different plans and different motivations going on.
And also, like, when we say the Italians, that doesn't include the Venetians, because Italy at this point did not consider itself like a politically unified place, and wouldn't for years. Like,
yes,
Venetians and say the Napolese, like, don't think that they are the same.
Indeed.
And arguably still don't.
Now, the siege of Zara began on November 10th, 1202. The leaders of Zara, faced with a combined Crusader Venetian army, initially attempted to negotiate their surrender with the Venetians. Members of the Crusader camp who were opposed to this whole operation, however, met with Zara's envoys and told them that if it came to it, the Crusaders would not fight them, only the Venetians would, and that encouraged Zara to break off the negotiations. And needless to say, these renegade Crusaders did not speak for the entire crusade. Even as the people of Zara hung banners of the cross on the city's walls to signify their Christian faith, the combined army began a bombardment with siege engines. Zara's leaders would eventually surrender the city on the 24th, thereby saving most of the population from death. The Crusaders and Venetians did, however, plunder the city quite thoroughly. For this act of attacking a Christian city, the entire crusade, Venetians and all, was excommunicated by Pope Innocent III. This is not exactly what Innocent had wanted.
But they didn't, know that at the time, right? It takes a long time for, news to travel.
Yeah, there's some confusion as to whether the papal envoy actually told them they would be excommunicated before the attack. It seems like the Pope, realized what was going on and tried letting them know, but most of them probably didn't hear about it until afterwards.
And now, after the side episode of Zara, we're moving on to the main dish of Constantinople. Let's flash back to the Byzantine side of things. 1202, the Byzantine emperor is Alexios III, who claimed the throne by, taking down his brother Isaac II. But Isaac II is still alive in a dungeon in Constantinople, while his 20-year-old son, named young Alexios, is in exile at the court of his brother-in-law, Philip of Swabia. I'm never going to be able to say Swabia with a straight face. In the Holy Roman Empire. Now, as it turns out, Philip of Swabia also happened to be the cousin of Boniface, one of the main leaders of the Fourth Crusade, because all of the nobility of Europe are incestuous as shit. And Boniface had departed from the main crusading force prior to their attack on Zara to make his way to visit Philip. We don't know exactly why he did this, but he visits Philip and he meets the young Alexios while everybody else is plundering Zara.
And getting excommunicated. Now, likely having heard of the dire financial straits the crusade was in, Alexios recognized the opportunity he had before him and made an offer to Boniface. Alexios told Boniface of the injustice of his father's deposal and sought his help in righting the wrongs done to his family. There's a lot of talk of chivalry and that sort of language used here. In exchange for the Crusader army sailing to Constantinople and deposing the usurper, Alexios offered the Crusaders a sum of 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 Byzantine troops for the crusade, the full services of the Byzantine navy, and the placement of the Eastern Roman Empire back under the religious jurisdiction of the papacy, effectively ending the Great Schism.
And he's making all these promises, right? Fleet full of cash, big ol' army, restoration of the papacy. But he's just some dude in Germany right now.
Yes.
He can't cash none of these checks.
No.
So this is just a 20-year-old dude fronting.
Yeah.
Young Alexios be fronting. Good to know.
Boniface allowed Alexios to return with him to join with the other leaders of the crusade, where Alexios' plan was presented in front of them. While some opposed it and left the crusade at this point, either returning home or sailing east personally to the Crusader states, ultimately the majority of the Crusaders, as well as Doge Enrico Dandolo, agreed to the scheme. For the Crusaders, this was a huge sum of money, almost an unimaginable sum, that could help their crusade, and it was also more manpower, which they were still lacking, for the eventual attack on Egypt. Dandolo, who was a former ambassador to Constantinople himself, likely knew that Alexios would have trouble fulfilling all of his promises and was just seeking the Crusaders' aid for personal gain. Nonetheless, for Venice, this was an opportunity to re-establish a large trade presence in Constantinople.
And it's worth noting that Constantinople as a city is like far richer in trade and spices and all of the colorful shit than basically anything in Europe could even dream of at this point.
Oh yeah, like the Republic of Venice, as powerful as it is at this time, Venice itself is still a third the size of Constantinople, optimistically. Pope Innocent III, for his part, also undid the excommunications and supported the endeavor, viewing it as an opportunity to bring the East back under the religious jurisdiction of Rome. This would finally heal the Great Schism.
Because you can just undo an excommunication. That thing where you declare a person is going to be damned to hell for all eternity?
Yeah.
You can just you can just takesy backsies that shit.
Yeah.
Because Catholics be rolling that way.
We're going to lose all of our Mormon and Catholic listeners thanks to this episode.
Listen, this is a Protestant podcast now, tomorrow, and right after I get shot by Jay and replaced by someone far prettier right after this podcast gets successful.
Yeah.
Anyway, we will now flash forward to the Crusaders arriving in Constantinople in July of 1203 and immediately setting about their preparations to seize the city. Now, those who have been to Constantinople will know that the city is bisected. The bulk of it, especially in the medieval time, lies on the west of the Strait of Bosporus. And to the south, there's a smaller inlet known as the Golden Horn. And the other side of the city is, of course, on the east of that strait. The city essentially just juts into the intersection of the Strait of Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Golden Horn, giving it a roughly triangular shape. We'll definitely have a diagram on the YouTube if you're confused at this point. The land route to Constantinople was protected on all sides by walls. North of the city, across the Golden Horn, lay the fortified citadel of Galata. A giant forged iron chain could be raised up or lowered into the water, span the width of the Golden Horn between Galata and the walls of Constantinople, and when raised, it prevents the ships from entering the Horn, protecting the Byzantine fleet and making the complete encirclement of the city very difficult to achieve, also inspiring a scene in the second Dance of Ice and Fire novels.
Yeah.
Constantinople's defenses meant that the city had withstood over a dozen sieges prior to 1203. However, you don't just have to worry about things externally, you gotta worry about them internally. See, Alexios III was a very unpopular emperor, disliked by both the people and the Byzantine aristocrats due to a weak economy and a series of defeats against the Seljuk Turks. He was essentially the Joe Biden of his time. The Byzantine navy was also in a state of disrepair, with most of its ships and equipment having been sold off by corrupt officials.
All in all, Alexios III still had around 20,000 men, but they were of questionable morale, and many of them likely had not been paid for their services. When the Crusaders landed north of the Golden Horn, they were met with initially stiff resistance, but the Byzantine defense, probably due to this low morale, soon collapsed, allowing the Crusaders to take Galata and lower the chain, which in turn allowed the Venetian fleet to enter into the Golden Horn.
Question. At what point do the Byzantines know that the Crusaders are coming with the Venetians to fuck them up?
So the Crusaders leave in like spring of 1203, and Alexios III figures out what's going on pretty quickly because, they can't sail directly to Constantinople. The fleet has to make a bunch of different stops, which they do in like Corfu and a couple of other like islands. These islands were a part of the Byzantine Empire, but they pretty much just switched sides when the Crusaders and, Alexios landed there because they didn't want to fight. But because of that, news did get back to Alexios that, there was a big, invasion coming. So yeah, but by July, Alexios knows what's coming for him.
So they show up, they take Galata, they lower the chain, and now the Venetian ships are sailing in.
Yeah. Following the capture of Galata, the Crusaders themselves were able to move upland and cross the Golden Horn to the north, where it's narrow and you actually have a bridge across it. While the Venetians prepared to assault the sea walls of the city that were facing the Golden Horn. These walls were much weaker than, the three great walls that you mentioned earlier, which faced the land route to Constantinople. This attack would begin on July 17th.
How do you... Oh, wait. I was about to say, how do you get through walls without cannons? Because ain't no cannons at this point in history. But I guess they have, like, trebuchets on their ships or something.
Yeah, they have siege engines mounted on ships. They also have, like, siege towers on their ships and stuff like that.
That sounds really fucking cool.
Yeah, the Venetians are known for the very powerful navy during this time period and later on especially. As the Crusaders and Venetians began their attacks on the walls of Constantinople, again on July 17th, they finally met stiff resistance. The Crusader force met with some success, but was beaten back from the walls by their rival, the Byzantine Varangian Guard. These were the elite guards of the Byzantine emperors. The Venetians similarly managed to capture parts of the seawall before being pushed back. They were, however, able to start a fire in the city that would rage throughout its northern neighborhoods.
This makes a lot of sense, right? Like, people are actually going to start fighting when you start coming for where they live, no matter what's politically going on at the time. As the Crusaders were pushed back, Alexios III decided to move to face them in open battle outside of the city walls of the bulk of his army. He's like, all right, here's my chance to, now everyone's rallied around the flag. I'm going to go out and I'm going to beat the foreigners and everyone's going to love me again. While this was a questionable decision because, you don't have to go and expose yourself like that, he did outnumber the Crusaders, and when his army was drawn up, the Crusaders were forced into a defensive position. Alexios, however, loses his nerve after, some opening skirmishes of the battle, and withdrew back to the city by nightfall. On the night of the 18th, Alexios III would flee the city with a small group of his supporters. The following day, the Byzantine people who were like, well, Emperor just fucking left us. Guess he ain't the Emperor no more. Free Isaac II and my cat just trampled all over my shit trying to get to the window, and that probably showed up on the mic recording. Or maybe it didn't, and I'm just speaking for no reason. Anyway, Isaac II gets a chance to be emperor again. Because, he's the guy in the city. He received the Crusaders' envoys and agreed to the terms his son had made with them, inviting into the city. So, Isaac II is now emperor, and the young Alexios was declared co-emperor Alexios IV, because, that's a thing you can do.
Yeah, the Romans do love their co-emperors, and there are quite a lot of them throughout Roman history.
Yeah, a lot of Roman and Byzantine history is attempts to split the baby, which almost always ends poorly, but they keep doing it because, it's kind of like a no one loses to SFAT 28 times in the row situation.
Yeah. I'm sure everybody understood that reference.
Yes, everybody at home has crossed out their Azalea rants about fascism bingo place. Azalea criticizes Joe Biden, and Azalea makes a reference to competitive Smash Melee on their bingo cards. Everything's going fine. This is a good episode of the podcast. We are not flaming out. Everything is fine. Let's talk about the reign of Alexios IV.
Yeah, let's. It's a good subject. So Alexios IV is officially co-emperor with his father, but in practice, he's the one calling the shots, because Isaac II, is blind and has been in a dungeon for like a decade. He's pretty old now, and he's in a pretty feeble state. While Alexios IV reigned in Constantinople, his grip over his empire was weak. Most of the provinces essentially ignored his demands. They were basically doing their own thing by this point. The treasury was nearly empty after Alexios III had removed what gold he could prior to fleeing from the city, making paying the Crusaders the 200,000 marks he owed to them rather difficult for the new emperor. Alexios IV thus resorted to raising taxes, seizing property, and melting down statues and even religious icons to pay his debt, but even then only managed to raise half of the sum that he owed. Now, Alexios IV probably knew that he would not be able to pay the full sum anytime soon, and was thus gambling on being able to wait out the Crusaders. Their leaders did agree to an extension on the repayment, and it was likely that the Crusader army would depart soon anyways, because its men were getting impatient due to their desire to return to their original mission of fighting the Muslims.
So the Crusader army is just like hanging out in the city?
Yeah, in and outside, they got like a big camp in Galata as well.
Oh, that's gonna get that is probably getting really rank at this point. Now, the plan of waiting them out and, hoping they'll just sort of go on to the Holy Land and get killed by the Muslims in Egypt, it probably would have worked if it were not for the fact the population of Constantinople, enraged by the new kid doing all this taxation and shit, turned violently against him. Riots broke out in the fall of 1203. This involved this city mob seizing a bunch of the Catholics who were already in the city and a few of the Crusaders and killing them. The Crusaders responded by killing civilians and attempting to take the Mosque of Constantinople. This chaos resulted in more fires that raged throughout the city, and suddenly Alexios IV's brief reign as emperor is just going up in literal flames. It was formally ended in January of 1204 as he was deposed by the fiercely anti-Catholic aristocrat Alexios Doukas. Alexios IV and Isaac II were imprisoned and killed, and Alexios took the throne as Alexios V, Doukas, and expelled the Crusaders from the city. So, just to recap, the Crusaders at this point showed up with not everybody there, showed up to Venice broke, went and sacked a Christian city on the way there, did some fighting that was successful, and then just won because the guy they were fighting pussied out, hung around the city for like 6 months getting drunk, start fucking shit up and killing people in the middle of the city, but then kind of returning. And now it's January of the next year, and everyone is fed up with everyone. The Crusaders are like, this is some bullshit. The Venetians are like, we still ain't been paid. There's a bunch of political internal struggles and shit going on in Constantinople. And the people of Constantinople, the real people who matter, they have been taxed and whipped up into mobs and had fucking Catholic soldiers who speak a whole different language than them, pushing them around. And this is what we in the business generally refer to as the fun zone we are about to enter into.
Now, all these events, as you imagine, enraged the Crusaders and the Venetians. For months, they had, in their minds, put up with the Byzantines, but now that had come to an end. Rather than install another claimant to the throne, they agreed that they would attack and seize Constantinople for themselves. This second attack on Constantinople began on April 12th, following months of preparations. This time, both the Venetians and the Crusaders would attack the seawall facing the Golden Horn. This attack initially met stiff resistance from the few defenders that were left, but the Crusaders were finally able to breach the walls near the northwest section of Constantinople and set fires that spread south into the city.
Now, like, the Constantinopolise, or whatever you call people who live in the city at the time, they could, like, see them prepping to siege the city, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, those guys over there, just preparing to kill us.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure that wasn't stressful at all.
Probably quite stressful. Large chunks of the Byzantine army had deserted by this point, including the famed Varangian guard, who had gone without pay for quite some time. And with his reign collapsing, and even though the Crusaders at this point have really only captured maybe like 5%, 10% of the city, they actually haven't captured much of it. Alexios V decided to follow in Alexios III's footsteps and flee the city with basically all the gold he could grab, leaving Constantinople basically open for the taking.
What followed Alexios V's flight and the subsequent fall of Constantinople on April 12th was nothing more than looting, death, and destruction on a grand scale. While the leaders of the crusade had instructed their men not to kill civilians and to bring confiscated plunder for central locations to distribution, many of the soldiers disobeyed their orders. Likely tens of thousands of the city's population were raped and killed by invaders. I mean, these guys have been away from home for 2 years plus at this point. They're horny as shit. They hate all of these people for religious reasons and just the usual bigotry of not liking people who don't like you and don't speak your language. And they've done battle and they've faced mortal peril and they could have died, but they didn't have to go all out and get really fucking exhausted in this brutal blood-chilling battle, right? That's kind of part of the anticlimax and the weird hijinks of the Fourth Crusade, is that not even Zara was a full-on fuckfest battle. And now, after 2 years of being led around on fetch quests and getting really pissed off, and when soldiers get let loose, they do a shit ton of damage, and now they're going to do a shit ton of damage, and the people of Constantinople are going to have to pay the price for their leaders' incompetence and then cowardice, and then their new leaders' incompetence and then cowardice, and then their new leaders' incompetence and cowardice. I just remembered that. Yep. We've gone through 3 fucking Alexioses, and they're all shit. Because all emperors are shit. Because none of them are good at what they do.
For both the Crusaders and the Venetians, the plunder to be gained from Europe's wealthiest city was the main prize, and they went about systematically looting Constantinople of its wealth and culture. Constantinople, unlike just about any other city of the Roman Empire, had remained essentially unlooted from the 4th century through to the 13th. While the empire had gone through its ups and downs, Constantinople remained a city in which the past lived on to a degree unrivaled in all of Europe. Art and architecture connecting the medieval Romans with their ancient forebears was everywhere, and it was now free for the taking. Statues, relics, and icons that had remained untouched by even the most mercurial Byzantine emperors were open game. While some would be sold or carted off to Italy, France, and elsewhere in Europe, most of them would be melted down, particularly the ancient bronze works dating back to classical Greece and Rome, which were seen as nothing more but pagan icons and sources of bronze coinage. The list of works of art destroyed by the Fourth Crusade is too long to cover here. Indeed, there are likely countless works that we don't even know about anymore, because they were destroyed. The Byzantine historian Niketas Koiniotas, who witnessed the sack of Constantinople himself, provided the identities of at least some of the ancient bronze statues lost to the greed of the Crusaders. These were statues of Hera, Paris, Bellerophon, Hercules, Romulus and Remus with the she-wolf of Rome, and more. You might have seen a marble statue of Hercules kind of leaning on a staff. That's essentially a Roman copy of an ancient Greek bronze statue. That bronze statue still existed until 1204. Perhaps the most poetic account provided by Koiniotis is that of a great bronze statue of Helen of Troy that was melted down by the Crusaders. He says, "It was said that these Aeneadae condemned you to the flames of retribution for Troy's having been laid waste by the firebrand because of your scandalous amours. But the gold madness of these men does not allow me to conceive and utter such a thing, for that madness was the reason why rare and excellent works of art everywhere are given over to total destruction."
So yeah, not a fun time. The Venetians saw more value in these ancient works than most. Some, such as the portrait of the four tetrarchs and the horse of St. Mark, still exist today, and they have been removed and relocated to Venice. That, however, is the exception. Most were just melted down for their weight in metal. Isn't, like, the horses of St. Mark and shit, like, important to, like, Venetian, like don't they get put in, like, the cathedrals and shit?
Yeah.
And, like, it becomes a whole thing?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if anywhere you go to Venice, anyone who goes to Venice and does all the standard tourist sites, one of them will be going to see the horses of St. Mark. And they're a pretty big deal.
Have you been to Venice?
I have not.
I've heard it, like, smells like an open sewer.
I'll have to, take your word for that. Or take
Which, I
the
mean,
word
I guess
of
I've been to
whoever told you.
Manhattan, and Manhattan also smells like an open sewer, so maybe it would be fine, but I don't know.
Yeah. Rather appropriately, a lot of this stuff actually then gets taken to France by Napoleon when he conquers Venice, but unfortunately they get returned to Venice, which I think is rather a shame. It would have been funny if they just either remained in Paris or got sent back to, I guess, then
The
Istanbul.
one thing that the Louvre chose to return to the people that the Europeans sacked it from. That's
it was like actually a part of like the terms of the Congress of Versailles, I believe.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
They, like, stopped the negotiation of the Great War to be like, no, and then you're gonna give us back the thing.
Yeah. Now, the destruction of Constantinople's art is a crime that, of course, pales in comparison with the depredations afflicted upon its people. But both serve as examples of the attitudes held by the Crusaders towards the city and its inhabitants. The Crusaders would go on to establish their own polity in Constantinople, what is commonly referred to as the Latin Empire, claiming it to be a direct continuation of Rome. We use the term Latin Empire, but they just call themselves, the Roman Empire, like the Byzantines had done. Coincidentally, this kind of upset the Holy Roman Emperor because, the whole deal was that, like, no, we're supposed to be the emperors, not them. But yeah. The first...
Yeah, if y'all aren't aware, the Holy Roman Empire is essentially like, Rome got sacked, and then, like, the Pope who was in Rome was like, well, because no one can tell me no, I'm the Roman emperor now. And then you, this guy in Germany, you swear fealty to me, and I'll just make you the Roman emperor because that's legit. And then they all said it was legit, but everyone knew that it wasn't legit.
It's Germans LARPing as Romans. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's like the Holy Roman Empire for 1,000 years was literally just a series of Europeans just going like, sure, buddy, to like that kid who was like making lightsaber noises and swinging around brooms in the corner of the class.
Yeah. The first emperor of this Latin Empire was elected from amongst the ranks of its leaders. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was initially considered, but he turned down the opportunity. Eventually it went to Baldwin IX, the Count of Flanders, who was more popular with the predominantly French knights of the campaign than the Italian leader Boniface. This actually almost resulted in a civil war between the two.
Dandolo went, to Constantinople at the age of 97?
Yeah, credit where credit's due. Dandolo went all the way.
Yo, that's legit G shit.
Yeah.
You're a fucking, blind ass, old, you're just, pissing yourself 17 times a day because you got fucking 1200s healthcare, and, you're just... You're like, no, I'll go to Constantinople. You can't even see the place. I guess it's got some nice smells.
Yeah.
So this Latin Empire is set up to then go on to a great and prosperous... No, this is the No One Is Competent podcast. You know what's going to happen. The Crusaders had achieved something genuinely remarkable by attacking and capturing Constantinople, not once but twice. But they would soon learn that conquering the city and governing it are two very different things. In the immediate months afterward, the city of Constantinople would enter into a period of decline in terms of both wealth and population. Because a lot of the population has been killed by drunken Frenchmen, and a lot of the wealth has been looted by greedy Italians.
Yeah.
Before, it was arguably the most prosperous city in the world, and now its rulers were reduced to stripping the lead tiles off the roof of Byzantine buildings to sell it for money. Roman gold coinage, once a standard for trade in the region, ceased to be minted as the Latin emperors did not have enough gold to mint. By the end of Latin rule, Constantinople was described as being less of a city and more of a collection of villages occupying the remains of a once great metropolis, which is to say exactly what New York is going to be in 40 years after climate change utterly remakes the eastern seaboard. Much of the same issues that plagued the Byzantine Empire persisted. The fledgling Latin Empire was surrounded by enemies who coveted Constantinople's position. Emperor Baldwin I's reign would last only 1 year because never put a Baldwin in charge, and he was killed in 1205 after the Crusaders were defeated in battle by the Bulgarian Tsar Boniface I, who had been made king of Thessaloniki in Greece, but...
Thessaloniki.
What?
Thessaloniki.
I didn't know the Kingdom of Hawaii was involved in this crusade.
Thessaloniki is it's a famous city. It's it's one of I think it's the second biggest city in Greece. I'm sure somebody will fact check me on that, but it's pretty big.
Huh.
Yeah. But yeah, good old Boniface, who's the king of Thessaloniki, also gets killed by the Bulgarians 2 years later.
Always be on the watch out for Bulgarians. They be lying in the cut.
Yeah, this was, the Bulgarian Tsar at the time, a guy named Kalyan, had actually offered the Crusaders an alliance earlier on, and they turned him down. They're basically like, we don't care about you, you're not important. And that kind of pissed him off. Kalyan was a man who was known for his temper. He would actually later get the title of the Roman Slayer for killing lots of Greeks and Latins. But yeah, not a guy you wanted as your enemy. Subsequent rulers of the Latin Empire would have to face off with threats from these Bulgarians, as well as the Serbians, Turks, and remnants of the Byzantine Empire that had held out following the fall of their capital. The Latin Empire would itself come to an end in 1261, as the most powerful of the Byzantine successor states, the Empire of Nicaea, reclaimed the city under Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologos. Constantinople would recover to a degree under the Palaeologos dynasty, who would rule the empire for the next 200 years, but it would never reach its former splendor, at least not in Byzantine hands. And also, needless to say, I forgot to even put it into the script because how much I forgot it, and the Crusaders forgot it. They never went to attack Egypt. That just kind of didn't happen. I mean, later Crusades would kind of try to attack Egypt. That would always remain on the cards, but nobody ever pulled it off.
You wrote an entire 19-page script about the perils of the Fourth Crusade. without mentioning the fact that the Fourth Crusaders didn't even fight any Muslims.
Yeah. I guess they technically, like, attacked the mosque in Constantinople, because there was a pretty big mosque there, but that was about it.
Was that the Hagia Sophia?
No, the Hagia Sophia was a church that gets turned into a mosque when the Ottomans conquer it. This was a different mosque that was basically just built for the Muslim traders. Yeah, there were a lot of Muslims and Jews in the city, and needless to say, neither were treated well by the Crusaders.
Yeah, no. So, what conclusion are we to draw from all of this? Well, a few. On the Byzantine side, your leaders have no idea what they're doing. They're just making whatever promises they can to get in power and be in power for a second. And then as soon as things get even a little bit rough, they will leave you taking all of the wealth with them. On the Catholic side, people are violent, they're very greedy, and sometimes they just want to hurt people because hurting people is fun. And big organizations and multinational conglomerates, when they go on campaigning for shit, mission creep tends to set in, and people just kind of do whatever in order to make themselves prestigious. There's also the story of the Latins, who just assumed that they could set up a whole damn empire, because how hard could it be? And yeah, it was pretty fucking hard. Ultimately, the only people who really benefited from any of this were the Venetians, who were able to set up a much more powerful trade empire and would eventually, be rich enough to make their entire city out of marble, because the lesson of history is to have no morals, have no ethics, and just sell people shit.
Pretty much.
Is that the episode?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's the episode. So, this has been the No One Is Competent podcast. You, of course, enjoyed that episode so much that you are going to go to our YouTube. You're going to like, you're going to subscribe, you're going to comment with a nice limerick. Limericks are cool. I have a friend who really enjoys limericks. I want to show her as many as possible. She's a very supporting person. You are then going to go to Apple Podcasts. You are going to leave a review and a 5-star rating. You are going to go to Twitter and follow us at not_competent. You are going to email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. And you are going to just bask in the love you have for your fellow man and how much you appreciate the glorious music of the legendary Sam Bryce, which I'm sure is rising right about now. Jay, any last things to say to the people?
Don't melt down ancient Greek statues if you ever are in the position to do so. It's very unwoke.
I have nothing else to say. Y'all be good.